Number 10. D.B. Cooper. Some people vanish by accident. D.B. Cooper vanished as performance. That is what makes him so difficult to separate from legend. He did not simply disappear from history. He staged his own disappearance in a way almost designed to outlive the facts. A suit, a tie, a calm voice, a commercial flight, a bomb threat, cash, a parachute, then night, weather, and open air over the Pacific Northwest. Few real people have stepped so cleanly out of the record and into myth while still alive. In November 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper, later immortalized in the American imagination as D.B. Cooper, boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. He was outwardly ordinary, quiet, controlled, forgettable in the most useful way. Then he handed a note to a flight attendant and revealed the basic shape of the event to come. He claimed to have a bomb, he demanded money and parachutes, and unlike so many crimes powered by panic, this one unfolded with eerie patience. That calm changed everything. Because Cooper did not behave like a man collapsing under desperation. He behaved like a man already inside a plan. He spoke carefully. He understood enough about the aircraft to raise suspicions that he may have known more than an ordinary passenger should. He negotiated, waited, took the ransom, and after the plane took off again, he lowered the rear stairs and jumped into darkness, somewhere over rugged country no sane person would choose lightly. Then he was gone. And once he was gone, the real man began losing ground to the symbol. Did he survive the jump? Was he trained? Was he military? Was he reckless and doomed from the start? Did he die in the wilderness within hours, leaving behind only one of the most elegant unsolved crimes in modern history? Or did he land, disappear, and live out the rest of his life under another name, carrying the private knowledge that he had stepped directly through the walls of the American system and left it guessing forever? That uncertainty is what transformed Cooper from fugitive into folklore, because the disappearance gave the public too much room, and the public filled it instantly. Cooper became a phantom of masculine competence, anti-authority cool, outlaw intelligence, and impossible escape. The details helped. He did not massacre anyone. He did not rant. He did not crumble. He simply took the money and walked out of one identity into weather and darkness. That is a nearly perfect mythic structure. The crime was real, but it carried the emotional shape of a story people wanted to believe could still happen in the modern world. That one calm, capable stranger could outwit bureaucracy and vanish cleanly into the land. The investigation only deepened that feeling. The FBI chased leads for years. Suspects emerged, collapsed, resurfaced. Physical evidence remained partial, frustrating, and never quite enough. Some ransom money turned up years later along the Columbia River, just enough to keep the mystery alive without resolving anything. That is the perfect amount of truth for legend to feed on. Not enough to close the story, but enough to prove the story never fully died. And that is why D.B. Cooper belongs here. He was a real man who for a brief stretch of time moved through the most ordinary systems imaginable: ticketing, boarding, flight service, negotiation, and then tore himself loose from the end of the record in a way so theatrical that history has never managed to reduce him back to a suspect file. One version of him may have died in the jump. Another version has been alive ever since in America's imagination. That is what it means to vanish into legend while still alive, not merely to disappear, but to disappear so well that the mystery becomes more durable than the person. Number 9. Percy Fawcett. Some people disappear into legend because they flee society. Percy Fawcett disappeared because he marched toward myth on purpose. That distinction matters. He did not stumble accidentally into obscurity. He walked into one of the most dangerous and symbolically loaded landscapes on Earth, the Amazon, carrying with him not just supplies and ambition, but an idea that the jungle concealed something older, greater, and more civilizationally significant than the modern world was prepared to admit. Once that kind of conviction enters a man, disappearance begins to look less like tragedy and more like transformation. Percy Harrison Fawcett was a British explorer, soldier, surveyor, and one of the last great figures of the imperial age of geographical obsession. He spent years in South America, moving through landscapes that to much of the outside world still appeared only partially mapped, partially understood, and thick with possibility. He was disciplined, experienced, and not easily dismissed as a fantasist in the cheap sense. That is part of why his legend became so strong. Fawcett was not a salon dreamer. He was the kind of man who could make impossible things sound plausible because he had survived so much already. And eventually, one idea consumed him. He became convinced that a lost ancient city, which he sometimes called Z, existed somewhere in the Amazonian interior. Not a crude village, not a minor ruin. Something grander, something that would challenge assumptions about the deep history of the region and perhaps vindicate the sense that the jungle had hidden a forgotten chapter of civilization. Critics found him too speculative. Admirers found him visionary. But either way, the search for Z gave his life a final narrative so powerful that once he vanished, people could no longer tell where the man ended and the quest began. In 1925, Fawcett entered the Brazilian jungle with his son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel. He never came back. That absence was enough to create mystery. But what made the mystery immortal was the world into which he disappeared. The Amazon does not merely conceal, it multiplies possibilities. Disease, starvation, miscalculation, violence, terrain, accident, encounter with indigenous groups. Each explanation is plausible, and none can be cleanly crowned without forcing the landscape into simplicity it does not allow. The jungle itself became a machine for generating versions of Fawcett's end. And then came the second life. Did he die quickly? Was he killed? Did he choose not to return? Did he find something? Was he absorbed into another way of life? Did he go mad, continue deeper, or decide that the world outside the forest was no longer his world at all? These ideas multiplied precisely because Fawcett had already framed his expedition in mythic terms. He was not just a missing explorer, he was the missing explorer who had gone looking for a lost civilization. That combination is almost impossible for history to resist. Many went after him. Rescue expeditions, followers, imitators, romantics, and opportunists all tried to trace the path or inherit the legend. Some of them died too. That only fed the aura. Fawcett's disappearance stopped being a single event and became a zone of attraction, almost a curse of unfinished exploration. The man vanished, but the idea he pursued remained alive enough to pull others after it. That is one of the clearest signs that a real person has already become more than himself in history. And the strangest part is that later archaeology gave the myth just enough oxygen. Modern research has increasingly shown that parts of the Amazon once contained more complex and extensive human settlement than older Western assumptions allowed. That does not prove Fawcett found Zed or that his specific vision was correct. But it does complicate the easy dismissal of him as simply deluded. That complication is perfect fuel for legend. It means the man may have been wrong in detail, but not entirely wrong in instinct, which is exactly the kind of ambiguity that keeps a disappearance alive forever. That is why Percy Fawcett belongs here. He was a real explorer, moving through a real landscape, following a real obsession, and then one day the archive lost him. But the story did not lose him. The story made him larger. Fawcett became the archetype of the man who goes far enough into the unknown that his identity merges with what he sought. Not just missing, transfigured by the search itself. He vanished into legend because he had already begun living inside one before he disappeared. Number 8. Michael Rockefeller. Some people vanish into legend because they were already famous. Michael Rockefeller vanished because he crossed the invisible line where privilege, anthropology, danger, and myth begin feeding on each other. That is what makes his story so haunting. He was not an anonymous adventurer swallowed by wilderness. He was the son of one of America's most powerful families, educated, curious, and drawn toward a part of the world that much of the West still imagined through the oldest and most unstable fantasies it had about the unknown. When someone like that disappears, the mystery does not remain private. It becomes a cultural event, and culture rarely resists turning such events into legend. In 1961, Rockefeller was in what was then Netherlands, New Guinea, now part of Indonesia, collecting Asmat art and moving through a region that fascinated anthropologists, collectors, and outsiders precisely because it seemed to stand at the edge of familiar modern narratives. He was not there as a pure thrill-seeker. He had serious interest in art, material culture, and the lives of the people he was encountering. But seriousness does not cancel danger, and curiosity does not erase the asymmetry built into such journeys. He was still a young American, from immense wealth entering a landscape the outside world treated as both intellectually valuable and existentially perilous. Then the boat overturned. Rockefeller and his companion were left in the water after their catamaran capsized off the coast. Rescue efforts unfolded, but at a certain point Michael made the decision that would define the rest of the story. Believing shore was reachable, he set out toward Yi land with improvised flotation and the now famous reported words, "I think I can make it." His companion remained behind and was later rescued. Michael Rockefeller was never seen again. That should have been enough to produce a tragic explanation. Drowning, exhaustion, currents, distance, exposure. Those possibilities alone are strong, but the case did not stop there because the cultural imagination around the disappearance was already primed for something darker. The region's outsider reputation, stories of conflict, speculation about local encounters, and the larger colonial and anthropological frame all combined to generate more disturbing possibilities. Had he drowned before reaching shore? Had he been killed? Had he been taken? Had he reached land only to vanish into a chain of events the official story could never cleanly recover? That is where the real man began dissolving into narrative. Because Rockefeller's disappearance immediately became bigger than one lost individual. It became a story about the collision between worlds, wealth and remoteness, collecting and consequence, modern confidence and environments that do not care about it. And where those collisions exist, myth rushes in fast. The missing heir in the dangerous frontier is one of the oldest narrative structures in modern history. It allows the public to stage all its anxieties at once about class, empire, vulnerability, and what happens when someone raised inside extraordinary protection reaches a place where protection no longer works. The rumours only deepened the transformation. Over time, accounts and speculation emerged suggesting he may have reached shore and met a violent end, perhaps in connection with local tensions and cycles of revenge outsiders only partially understood. Some of these ideas have been treated with more seriousness than others, but none have ever settled into universally accepted closure. That unresolved state is crucial. If drowning had been confirmed decisively, the story would still be sad. It would not feel mythic in quite the same way. Legend requires the gap, and Michael Rockefeller's case has never lost it. That gap is what turned him into a historical ghost of a specific kind, not an occult ghost, a 20th century ghost, a figure produced by the meeting of anthropology, media, elite family legacy, and the uncomfortable truth that modernity does not eliminate older forms of danger. It only changes who thinks they can survive them. Rockefeller vanished in a moment that exposed the fragility of all the assumptions surrounding his presence there. And once those assumptions broke, the story could no longer be contained by biography alone. That is why he belongs on this list. He was real, documented, visible, and culturally legible. Then the record failed at the point people expected it to continue. And when a story that important fails in that way, myth begins building immediately from the missing pieces. One Rockefeller was lost in New Guinea. Another has remained alive ever since in books, rumour, speculation, and the larger Western imagination of the fatal edge between civilization and the unknown. That is what it means to vanish into legend while still alive, to disappear once in body, and then continue disappearing forever in explanation. Number 7. Subhas Chandra Bose. Some people vanish into legend because the evidence is thin. Subhas Chandra Bose vanished into legend because the stakes were too large for the truth, whatever it was, to remain politically simple. That is what separates his case from ordinary disappearance. Bose was not just a missing man. He was one of the most powerful and controversial anti-colonial figures of his era, a nationalist leader whose life had already become larger than the institutions trying to contain him. When a figure like that reaches the edge of the record, absence does not stay empty for long. It becomes a battlefield. Bose had already broken the ordinary boundaries of political life well before his disappearance. A major Indian nationalist leader, deeply committed to ending British rule, he had also chosen a path radically different from more moderate or non-violent currents in the independence movement. During World War II, he sought alliances with Axis powers in pursuit of India's liberation, a decision that made him both admired and deeply contested. He led the Indian National Army and became, to supporters, the embodiment of militant anti-colonial will. To critics, he embodied a darker and more dangerous gamble. Either way, he was never a figure history could absorb quietly. Then came August 1945. The conventional account holds that Bose died from burns after a plane crash in Japanese-occupied Taiwan while attempting to move through a collapsing wartime landscape. That explanation has official weight, witnesses, and repeated reaffirmation in various forms. Under many historical conditions, it would have settled the matter. But Bose's story was not happening under normal conditions. The war was ending in chaos. Empires were shifting. Intelligence services were moving in shadow. Anti-colonial hopes were surging. And Bose himself had already proven unusually capable of slipping through borders, surveillance, and political expectation. That made finality difficult from the start. Supporters doubted the crash story. Rumors spread that he had survived. Some believed he escaped to the Soviet sphere. Others imagined secret detention, covert return, hidden monastic life, or a deliberate decision to remain underground until a future political moment. These theories did not survive merely because people enjoy conspiracy. They survived because Bose's life had already taught people that the impossible was sometimes exactly what he attempted. Once a man has repeatedly refused the expected route, history finds it hard to believe in his ordinary death, and politics made everything heavier. Independent India did not inherit Bose as a neutral memory. It inherited him as unfinished force. Different factions could use him differently: martyr, militarist, betrayed patriot, lost leader, alternate future of Indian nationalism. In that environment, the question of whether he died in a crash was never purely forensic. It was symbolic. If Bose lived, then history still had an unopened door. If he died, then one of the most volatile alternate paths of modern India ended in fire before the new nation began. That kind of symbolic pressure keeps legend alive even when evidence tries to close it. Investigations, commissions, files, and debates only widened the aura. Instead of burying the mystery, repeated official attention often reinforced the sense that something remained unresolved. Conflicting interpretations, incomplete public confidence, and the release of documents over time all contributed to the same atmosphere. That Bose's end was not merely a historical detail, but one of those cases where the archive itself seemed unable to produce emotional closure. The more people looked, the more the disappearance began to resemble a permanent national wound disguised as a question of fact. That is why he became doubled in memory. One Bose died in 1945, if the official account is correct. Another Bose never stopped travelling through rumour. That second Bose survived in whispers of return, in hidden identities, in allegations of secret survival, in the conviction that a man so defiant could not have exited history in such a conventional way. Legends like that do not depend only on evidence. they depend on political desire. Bose remained useful to hope, to grievance, to unresolved nationalism, and to the deep human need to believe that decisive figures do not always die when the record says they do. That is what makes his case so powerful. He did not vanish into legend because no one cared enough to look. He vanished into legend because too many people cared too much to accept one answer. His disappearance was swallowed by a world too unstable and by a post-war future too contested for clean closure to survive. That is why his name still carries a charge very few missing political figures retain. It is not simply that he may have lived. It is that the possibility of his continued life became part of the emotional architecture of history itself. And once that happens, the person is no longer only a person. He becomes a return that never arrives, a death that never feels fully witnessed. A political ghost history keeps arguing with because losing him cleanly would mean accepting that one of its most dangerous alternate futures truly ended. That is why Subhas Chandra Bose belongs here. Because few real people have remained so alive in rumour after disappearing from the record. And few disappearances have shown so clearly that when politics cannot accept an ending, it creates a legend to keep the person moving. Number 6. Raoul Wallenberg. Some people vanish into legend because the world never knew them well enough while they were present. Raoul Wallenberg vanished into legend because the world knew exactly what kind of man he appeared to be, and then could not bear the shape of his disappearance. During the final phase of World War II, in Budapest, Wallenberg became one of the most extraordinary rescue figures of the century. A Swedish diplomat operating amid the collapse of Nazi power and the machinery of genocide, he used protective passports, safe houses, negotiation, audacity, and sheer moral courage to help save large numbers of Hungarian Jews from deportation and death. He moved through one of history's darkest landscapes, not as a soldier commanding armies, but as a man weaponizing paperwork, neutrality, and nerve against extermination. That alone would have secured his place in history. But it also set the stage for one of the most haunting disappearances of the 20th century. In January 1945, as Soviet forces entered Budapest, Wallenberg was detained by the Soviets. From that moment onward, the record begins to fracture. He did not disappear into wilderness or sea. He disappeared into state custody, which is often far more disturbing. Nature can erase. Empires can conceal. A jungle leaves silence by indifference. A security system leaves silence by design. That is what makes Wallenberg's case so difficult to shake. The man who had helped save others from bureaucratic death vanished into the bureaucratic darkness of another regime. And once that happened, the real person began dividing into versions. Did he die soon after arrest, as some official Soviet-era claims suggested? Was he executed? Did he perish in prison? Was he held for years under another identity inside the Soviet penal or intelligence system? Could he have remained alive long after governments insisted otherwise, reduced to a number, a file, or a ghost moving through institutions built to make human beings disappear without witnesses? These possibilities did not emerge from fantasy alone. They emerged because the Soviet state was exactly the kind of system in which such uncertainty felt tragically plausible. That is what transformed Wallenberg from heroic diplomat into legend, because his fate became inseparable from the Cold War architecture of secrecy itself. Archives remained incomplete. Testimony was contradictory. Official statements shifted. Investigations produced fragments rather than peace. In another kind of story, the rescuer dies and memory crowns him cleanly. In Wallenberg's story, the rescuer enters a machine of obscurity and never properly emerges. That gives the case a uniquely painful symbolic force. He did not just save lives in history, he was then swallowed by history's second darkness, the darkness of states that insist on controlling what can be known. That uncertainty has kept him in permanent motion. Wallenberg's disappearance does not feel like a closed tragedy because every new document, every archival hint, every witness rumour, Every reopened inquiry has seemed to reopen the possibility that the end was worse, longer, and more hidden than the public was first told. That is the perfect fuel for historical legend, not because it turns him into a fantasy hero, but because it traps him in a condition history cannot resolve. He remains morally vivid, politically important, and personally unfinished all at once. And there is another reason the case lingers so powerfully. Wallenberg vanished at the exact point where heroism should have been rewarded by survival. That emotional violation matters. We expect people like him to die nobly or live to testify. Instead, he crossed from rescue into disappearance without ceremony, as if the 20th century were too dark to even allow moral closure. That is why his legend carries such sorrow. It is not simply a mystery about where he went. It is a mystery about whether history ever gave him back the dignity of an ending. That is why he belongs here. He was real, documented, active, courageous, and central to one of the most important rescue efforts of the war. Then he was removed from sight by forces that specialized in the controlled destruction of certainty. From that point onward, one Wallenberg belonged to diplomatic history. Another belonged to rumor, prison legend, Cold War secrecy, and the unbearable hope that perhaps he endured longer than anyone could prove. That is what it means to vanish into legend while still alive. Not merely to go missing, but to go missing inside a system so secretive that the world keeps waiting, decades later, for the end of the story to be released. Number 5. Arthur Cravan. Some people vanish into legend because history needs an unsolved hero. Arthur Cravan vanished because he was already trying to turn his own life into an act of disappearance long before he was lost. That is what makes him so different from the others on this list. Cravan did not merely fall out of the record. He seemed to live in active rebellion against the idea of a stable record in the first place. Poet, boxer, provocateur, self-inventor, and cultural saboteur, he moved through the early 20th century like someone determined to remain larger than whatever category tried to hold him. With a man like that, disappearance is never just disappearance. It feels like the final form of the performance. Born Fabian Avenarius Lloyd, Cravan cultivated persona as if it were both weapon and artwork. He was linked to avant-garde currents, scandal, literary provocation, and the raw theatricality of a man who preferred confrontation to coherence. He insulted reputations, reinvented himself constantly, boxed publicly, wrote chaotically, and carried the energy of someone less interested in building a career than in detonating expectations. In many ways, he looked like a prototype for an entire future culture of self-mythologizing artists and anti-art legends. Then history gave him the one thing a figure like that could never resist becoming: missing. In 1918, while in Mexico and heading into a world already destabilized by war, borders, and private upheaval, Cravan set out by small boat, reportedly intending to sail towards South America. He was never seen again. On the surface, that offers several simple explanations: drowning, storm, exhaustion, accident at sea. Those are plausible, perhaps overwhelmingly plausible, but ordinary explanation does not always survive contact with an extraordinary personality. Once a man like Arthur Cravan disappears, the sea does not close the story. It opens it, because his life had already trained people not to believe in ordinary endings. Did he die at sea? Almost certainly possible. Did he fake his death? Did he drift into another identity? Did he simply continue his long campaign of self-erasure and reinvention somewhere beyond the reach of official memory? These possibilities cling to Cravan, not because the evidence strongly demands them, but because his character invites them. He had already lived as though names were provisional, public selves were costumes, and scandal was a form of authorship. In that context, disappearance feels less like interruption than completion. That is why his legend grew so naturally. Cravan belonged to a historical moment that already loved artistic extremity. But he pushed beyond even that. He was not only avant-garde in work, He was avant-garde in being. His life seemed composed from fragments that refused stability, and later generations of artists, writers, and cultural mythmakers recognized in him the ideal vanished figure, the man who made his own biography untrustworthy. Once such a person disappears physically, the legend almost writes itself. He becomes the patron saint of self-invention escaping the archive. And the archive is exactly what cannot contain him. That is the key to Cravan's afterlife. Some missing people leave behind too little. Cravan left behind too much unstable energy. Every recovered anecdote, every outrageous act, every half-documented movement across borders makes him feel less like a historical subject and more like a fuse burning toward absence. The man seems to be disappearing even before he disappears. That is rare. And once it happens, historians are left not only with missing evidence, but with a personality almost designed to sabotage certainty. That sabotage is part of the appeal. Arthur Cravan has survived not just as a missing person, but as a missing type, the artist who may have drowned, may have fled, may have become someone else, and may in some sense have always intended to evade the final claim of biography. Whether that romanticizes the likely reality of death at sea is another question. But that is what legend does. It seizes whatever in a person feels already larger than a documented ending and keeps it moving. That is why he belongs here. He was real. He wrote, fought, scandalized, crossed countries, loved dramatically, and lived as if identity itself were a provocation. Then he vanished into water, distance, and possibility. One Arthur Cravan may have died in 1918. Another has never stopped walking through art history as the man who turned disappearance into his last and greatest invention. That is what it means to vanish into legend while still alive, to leave behind a life so unstable, so theatrical, and so resistant to fixed interpretation that the missing body becomes almost secondary. The person keeps going, because the myth had already learned how to live without him. Number 4, Ambrose Bierce. Some people vanish into legend because they were swallowed by mystery. Ambrose Bierce vanished because he seemed almost to walk into the kind of ending he might have written for himself. That is what makes his disappearance so enduring. Bierce was not merely a missing man. He was already a literary presence shaped by cynicism, precision, death, irony, and the sense that human beings often move toward absurd endings with far more confidence than wisdom. When a writer like that disappears into a revolution at the edge of old age, history does not know how to leave him alone. It starts reading the disappearance as if it were one of his final lines. By the time he vanished, Bierce was already a major American writer, journalist, and critic, known for his sharp tongue, Civil War experience, dark wit, and the cold brilliance of works that looked directly at violence, mortality, and illusion. He had built a reputation as a man difficult to romanticize in life, hard-edged, skeptical, often severe. That matters, because people like Bierce are not usually expected to drift passively into myth. Yet myth found him anyway, and it found him through Mexico. In 1913, after years of writing and public life, Bierce traveled south during the Mexican Revolution. He moved through a world already unstable with war, shifting allegiances, violence, and rumor. His letters from the journey survive in fragments, giving the sense of a man still in motion, still observant, still dryly alive to danger. Then the letters stop. The record thins. And somewhere inside revolutionary Mexico, Ambrose Bierce disappears. That is the moment the real man begins splitting in two. One Bierce is historical, an aging writer traveling through a violent landscape and likely meeting an unrecorded death in circumstances that could easily have swallowed countless others. That explanation is plausible, perhaps the most plausible. But another Bierce emerges instantly beside him, the writer who deliberately chose an ending worthy of his own worldview, the man who stepped into revolution because ordinary old age would have been too dull, too anticlimactic, too unlike the severity he spent a lifetime sharpening into prose. That second Bierce is harder to kill, Because the Mexican Revolution is exactly the kind of setting that makes disappearance expand instead of close. Execution, illness, random killing, battlefield chaos, banditry, misidentification, secret burial. Each possibility is believable, and the violence of the period provides no neat mechanism for final clarity. Once the archive fails inside a historical landscape already full of broken lines, history becomes vulnerable to narrative instinct. And narrative instinct looks at Ambrose Bierce and says, "Of course he vanished like this." That is what transformed the case from absence into legend. If a banker or salesman had vanished along the same route, history might have treated it as tragic obscurity. But Bierce had already written himself into a persona severe enough to survive missingness. He understood death too well. He understood human absurdity too well. He understood war too well. So when he vanished, later generations began treating the event not only as a mystery, but as a kind of darkly fitting consummation. The man who saw through illusion most clearly had himself become impossible to pin down. And that creates a very specific kind of legend. Not hopeful, not romantic in the usual sense. Bierce does not survive in rumour as a hidden king, secret survivor, or returning hero. He survives as the man whose end history lost in a landscape violent enough to erase him and literary enough to preserve the shape of the erasure forever. That is rarer and perhaps more powerful. His legend does not promise return. It promises coherence between life and vanishing, as though disappearance itself became his final style. That is why he belongs here. He was real, documented, prominent, and intellectually unmistakable. Then he moved into one of the world's most unstable political spaces and passed beyond the edge of the surviving record. From that point onward, one Ambrose Bierce remained in libraries. Another walked forever through revolutionary dust, never quite dead enough for history to close the file cleanly. That is what it means to vanish into legend while still alive. Not merely to be lost, but to be lost in a way that feels too perfectly aligned with the person you had already become. Number 3. Anastasia Romanov. Some people vanish into legend because no body is found. Anastasia Romanov vanished into legend because history created a void so emotionally unbearable that the world rushed to fill it with survival. That is what makes her case so powerful. It is not simply a mystery about whether one young woman escaped execution. It is a story about monarchy, revolution, innocence, grief, and the refusal to accept that a dynasty could end so brutally and so completely. Once that refusal entered the public imagination, the real Anastasia became inseparable from the possibility that she had somehow slipped through history's closing hand. Anastasia was the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, part of the Romanov family, whose fall became one of the defining symbols of imperial collapse in the 20th century. After the Russian Revolution, the family was held in captivity, moved, reduced, and eventually murdered in 1918 by Bolshevik forces in Yekaterinburg. In historical terms, the execution was tied to the terrifying logic of revolutionary finality. A royal family was not merely removed, it was extinguished. But extinction is hard for the imagination to accept when youth is involved. And that is where Anastasia became different from the others, because the public does not hold all dead royals the same way. A young daughter carries a different symbolic charge. She can become the hidden survivor, the lost princess, the living remnant of a destroyed world. In the years that followed the Romanovs' deaths, uncertainty about the full fate of the family, incomplete information, rumor, exile politics, and the emotional appetite for one surviving child combined to produce a legend of extraordinary endurance. Out of that hunger emerged claimants, whispers, sightings, and stories insisting that Anastasia had escaped. The most famous of these figures was Anna Anderson, whose claim to be the surviving Grand Duchess turned the question into one of the great identity dramas of the century. That alone would have been enough to keep the story alive. But the case carried more than curiosity. It carried need. Monarchists needed continuity. Sympathizers needed mercy. The public needed a crack in the cruelty. A world that could accept a massacre still wanted one exception. One child hidden, one secret rescue, one proof that history had not been quite as absolute as it looked. Anastasia became the vessel for that hope. And once hope takes that shape, legend becomes very difficult to reverse. For decades, the survival story moved through courts, memoirs, popular culture, journalism, and family dispute. The real Anastasia, a historical person with a finite life, was gradually overlaid by a second Anastasia, the missing daughter who might still be out there under another name, the Romanov shadow wandering through Europe, the rightful remnant of a murdered dynasty. The more the story spread, the less it belonged to archives and the more it belonged to emotional mythology. That mythology was powerful precisely because it was not irrational in a simple way. It fed on real confusion, real gaps, real revolutionary secrecy, and the chaos of post-imperial collapse. It also fed on the deep human inability to tolerate total endings when children stand inside them. That is why Anastasia's legend survived so intensely. It offered not just conspiracy, but moral relief. If she lived, then history had not closed with complete brutality. If she lived, then the Romanovs had one last pulse. If she lived, then innocence had slipped past the firing line. Eventually, science cut brutally through the dream. Forensic evidence, DNA analysis, and the recovery and identification of the Romanov remains established overwhelmingly that Anastasia did not survive. The legend, in factual terms, collapsed. And yet even there, the story did not truly die, because it had already become one of those rare myths that reveals more about the age that needed it than about the event itself. The false Anastasia mattered historically because so many people needed her to exist. That is why she belongs here. Not because she literally disappeared into the wilderness or lived under 1,000 aliases, but because while still alive in the imagination of the 20th century, she ceased to belong only to the murdered girl, history records. She became the hidden daughter, the survivor, the impossible heir, the human refusal of revolutionary finality. One Anastasia died in 1918, another remained alive for generations in rumor, hope, cinema, imposture, and grief. That is what it means to vanish into legend while still alive, to become more present in the world as a possibility than as a person. And few historical figures have ever been transformed that completely by the public need for one life not to have ended where history says it did. Number 2, Kaspar Hauser. Some people vanish into legend because they disappear at the end of their story. Kaspar Hauser vanished into legend because mystery wrapped around him from the moment he appeared. That is what makes him so unsettling. He did not begin as an ordinary person, later lost to rumor. He entered history already looking like a riddle, a young man emerging into public view in 1828 Nuremberg with almost no clear past, limited speech, strange behavior, and a story so disturbing that Europe immediately began asking whether it was witnessing trauma, fraud, conspiracy, or the broken remnant of something dynastic and hidden. He seemed to come from nowhere, and history is always vulnerable to people who arrive that way. Kaspar claimed he had been raised in near-total isolation, cut off from ordinary human life, held in darkness, and taught almost nothing of the world. Whether every detail of that account was true has been debated ever since, but what mattered immediately was the emotional force of the image. A pale, damaged, barely formed young man appearing in a modern city as if delivered from some secret imprisonment, touched nearly every anxiety of the age at once: aristocratic scandal, hidden heirs, abuse, identity, innocence, and the possibility that a person could be erased from society without technically dying. That is why speculation accelerated so quickly. Who was he really? A fraud? A victim? A mentally damaged youth rehearsing a tale he only partly understood? Or was he, as many believed, the concealed child of noble or even princely blood, hidden away so that a political succession could be altered. That last possibility became the most intoxicating. If true, Kaspar was not merely a tragic curiosity. He was living evidence that power could rewrite bloodline in secret and then lose control of the human being left behind. And once that idea entered public consciousness, the real Kaspar began losing ground to the symbolic one. He became the hidden prince, the stolen heir, the child locked away so another future could be installed in his place. Whether the evidence supported that fantasy cleanly was almost beside the point. The public imagination had already found what it needed. Kaspar's uncertainty made him infinitely reusable. He could serve as a victim of aristocratic crime, a moral warning about human isolation, a case study in damaged development, or a living accusation against the invisible violence of hierarchy. The less settled he was, the larger he became. Then came the injuries. Kaspar survived one earlier attack, or alleged attack, under suspicious circumstances, which only intensified belief that someone wanted him silenced. That matters enormously, because once a mysterious figure is physically harmed inside an already unstable narrative, doubt hardens into plot. If he was attacked, by whom? If he was lying, why such danger? If he was telling the truth, how high did the fear around him reach? Each new incident widened the legend instead of narrowing it. And then, in 1833, he suffered the wound that killed him. Even his death failed to settle anything. Was he murdered? Did he stage the encounter and fatally injure himself? Was it a final act of conspiracy or collapse? The ambiguity of the end was almost too perfect. A man who entered history from obscurity left it the same way, wounded, debated, unresolved. No version of the story could fully destroy the others. Fraud remained possible. Noble blood remained possible. Manipulation remained possible. Psychological instability remained possible. Kaspar Hauser became one of those rare figures whose entire life seems to exist inside contested explanation. That is why he belongs so high on this list, because he did not merely disappear from the record. He disappeared into interpretation. The real person, damaged, uncertain, probably frightened, perhaps deceptive in ways he himself could not fully control, was gradually overwhelmed by the narratives built around him. One Kaspar Hauser lived and died in 19th century Germany. Another has never stopped moving through European imagination as the lost heir, the fabricated innocent, the political victim, the wounded enigma no one could ever fully identify. That is what it means to vanish into legend while still alive, to become impossible to see clearly even before death arrives. To survive in history less as a resolved human being than as a chamber of unanswered identity. And few people have ever remained so alive in uncertainty as Kaspar Hauser. Number 1. Count of Saint-Germain. Some people vanish into legend because they disappear. The Count of Saint-Germain became legend because he seemed never to belong fully to ordinary mortality even while he was alive. That is what makes him the perfect number 1. Long before any final disappearance, Saint-Germain was already moving through Europe like a man made from rumour. He appeared in aristocratic circles, courts, salons, and diplomatic environments during the 18th century, carrying all the qualities history finds most dangerous in one person: wealth without clear source, learning without obvious limit, polish without stable biography, access without visible origin, and a style so composed that people began treating him less as a man than as a phenomenon. He was real enough to leave marks. That matters. The Count of Saint-Germain was not simply an invented occult fantasy born centuries later. He was known in elite European society, connected with courts including that of Louis XV, and described as a man of extraordinary linguistic ability, refined manners, scientific curiosity, artistic skill, and social intelligence. He moved easily among the powerful, yet remained opaque enough that no single origin story satisfied observers. Depending on who was talking, He was nobleman, adventurer, alchemist, spy, charlatan, genius, mystic, diplomat, or something stranger. That instability made him perfect for legend. Because every society has a weakness for the person who seems to know too much and age too little. Stories grew around him almost naturally. He was said to possess hidden knowledge, immense longevity, secret formulas, uncanny memory, and perhaps even the ability to move through time or survive beyond ordinary human limits. People claimed he spoke of past centuries as though he had witnessed them. Others treated him as a master of esoteric wisdom, chemistry, politics, and courtly manipulation all at once. He became the sort of figure who makes the 18th century itself feel like a masquerade concealing deeper chambers. And unlike many legends, this one was nourished by the man's own style of presence. Saint-Germain did not seem interested in stabilizing his identity for the comfort of others. He benefited from ambiguity. He moved through elite circles with enough polish to command attention, enough talent to silence easy dismissal, and enough mystery to provoke endless speculation. That is one of the most important elements in his transformation. He was not simply misinterpreted by the world. He appears to have understood, at least in part, the power of remaining indeterminate. Once a man begins living that way, disappearance becomes less an accident than an extension of method. Then came the official death. The Count of Saint-Germain is generally recorded as dying in 1784. But for legend, that changed nothing. In some ways, it made everything worse. Because once a figure like that is declared dead, later sightings become irresistible. Reports surfaced placing him in later years, later decades, later contexts. Occult traditions revived him. Theosophical and esoteric circles elevated him further. He became not just an intriguing 18th century adventurer, but a being who might have outlived his own century, perhaps many centuries, perhaps death itself in the ordinary sense. At that point, the historical person was no longer merely accompanied by myth. He had been almost entirely absorbed into it. That is why no one on this list better fits the title. Others disappeared into wilderness, revolution, sea, prison, or political uncertainty. Saint-Germain disappeared into a second life built from whispers of immortality. One version of him may have been a brilliant and self-inventing court figure whose mystery was amplified by gossip, performance, and elite fascination. But another version became far larger, the deathless count, the eternal traveller, the hidden adept moving across centuries behind the scenes of history. And once that transformation happened, the real man could never come back unchanged, because the Count of Saint-Germain touches a deeper historical desire than ordinary missing persons do. He represents the fantasy that a human being might escape not only biography, but time, that the right mixture of wealth, secrecy, knowledge, and composure could loosen the grip of mortality itself. He is less a missing person than a surviving idea in human form, the aristocratic stranger who knows hidden things and never truly exits the room. That is why he deserves number one. He did not just vanish while still alive, he taught history how to imagine a person becoming legend before death could ever claim him cleanly. And perhaps that is the most unsettling kind of disappearance there is. Not the body lost, not the identity blurred, but the man who becomes myth so completely that even his death feels like one more rumor he left behind.